They say you Don and Oppos. Truly know your neighbors until the sirens start wailing, until the sky turns a bruised shade of charcoal and the air tastes like burnt memories. But on Maplewood Lane, we didn't just learn who our neighbors were. We learned that our HOA president, Karen Donaldson, was a woman who would literally watch the world burn if it meant protecting a single, precious petal of her prize-winning begonias. It started as a typical Tuesday, the kind of suburban morning where the only drama is a squirrel getting too bold with a bird feeder or Raj Patel's drone buzzing a bit too close to a hedge, until the smoke started curling from house number 17, the Miller family's home, thick and black and hungry, rising into the Colorado sky like a signal fire for a war we didn't know was coming. When the fire truck screeched into the cul-de-sac, tires smoking and sirens still screaming their metallic lungs out, we all poured onto our porches, hearts in our throats because the Millers Warren and Oppos, answering their door, and the heat was already making the siding on their garage bubble and warp like melting wax. The firefighters moved with that beautiful, practiced precision that makes you feel like everything might actually be okay. One connecting the heavy yellow hose to the hydrant while two others prepared to breach the front door. But then, the gate to the Donaldson fortress swung open, and out stepped Karen, not with a bucket of water or a blanket for the family, but with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield and a pair of freshly sharpened garden shears in her hand. I can still hear her voice, that high-pitched, nasal screech that had terrorized middle schoolers for 20 years back when she was a principal, cutting through the roar of the flames as she marched toward the fire captain. End quote. "What the hell do you think you're doing with that vehicle?" End quote. She shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the truck's tires, which were resting on a strip of decorative rose tiles. Tiles the HOA had paid $10,000 to install just the previous summer. The fire captain, a man who looked like he'd seen every kind of hell the world could throw at him, just stared at her, blinking through the soot on his face, and said, end quote, "Ma and Oppos. There is an active structure fire. Lives are at stake. Please step back behind the line." End quote. But Karen Donaldson didn't and Oppos. Do end quote. Back. End quote. She did end quote. Order, end quote. And in her twisted, suburban warrior brain, a fire wasn't and Oppos. An emergency. It was an unauthorized deviation from the Maplewood Lane aesthetic guidelines. End quote. You are destroying HOA-approved landscaping. This is a protected decorative pathway. End quote. She screamed, her nostrils flaring as she waved her clipboard like a sword. And then, in a moment that will be whispered about in every dive bar and firehouse for the next 50 years, she looked down at the fully pressurized hose snaking across her precious tiles, and she snapped. No one moved fast enough. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion as she sprinted back to her garage, returned with those heavy-duty shears, the kind meant for decapitating stubborn oak branches, and knelt down beside the hose with the crazed determination of a woman avenging 1,000 dandelions. With one violent, manic snip, she sliced through the reinforced fabric, and the world just exploded. A geyser of high-pressure water erupted 60 feet into the air. The firefighter at the nozzle lost all pressure just as he was entering the house. The kickback sent him tumbling backward into the scorched bushes, and within 10 seconds, 10 fatal, agonizing seconds, the front beam of the Miller home gave way in a rain of embers and shattered glass. Standing there in the middle of the chaos, drenched by the spray of the ruptured hose, was Karen, her arms crossed and a smug, terrifyingly satisfied smirk on her face as she looked at her now in quote, protected in quote, tiles, while the rest of us watched the Miller family's entire life turn into a funeral pyre. By the time the backup hose was connected, the kitchen was incinerated, the high school championship trophies were melted into unrecognizable blobs of plastic, and the neighborhood stood in a silence so heavy it felt like lead, watching the fire chief glare at Karen with a mix of horror and pure, unadulterated pity. End quote. "You endangered lives," end quote, he said, his voice trembling with a rage that went deeper than words. But Karen was already kneeling down, inspecting a wilting begonia, as if the ashes of her neighbor and Oppos' house were just some inconvenient dust. By that evening, the clip of end quote, hose hacker Karen end quote, had hit the 6:0 and Oppos' clock news, shared by Sasha, our resident TikToker, who'd caught the whole thing on her phone, and the internet absolutely exploded, photoshopping Karen's face onto villains from every action movie imaginable. But back on Maplewood Lane, the air didn't indopos. Tea just smelled like smoke. It smelled like resolve. The HOA released a sterile, gutless statement about, end quote, reviewing protocols, end quote. But they didn't indopos. Tea fire her. They didn't indopos. Tea condemn her, because Karen, end quote, was, end quote. The board, a dictator who had spent a decade building a web of bylaws that protected her from everything, except, perhaps, the collective fury of a neighborhood that had finally seen enough. The morning after was a gray, ash-strewn nightmare, with the scorched husk of House 17 standing like an accusing finger in the middle of our perfect little cul-de-sac. And when Karen's pearl-white Lexus rolled up to the curb, she didn't indopos. Tea get out to offer an apology. She got out wearing a crisp beige pantsuit, clipboard in hand, and marched straight to the Millers, who were standing in their driveway clutching binder full of insurance documents and trying to explain to their crying son why his comic book collection was gone. End quote. I hope you filed the damage report for the community landscaping, end quote, Karen said, her voice lacking even a microscopic grain of empathy, end quote. Those rose tiles are going to cost a fortune to replace, and the soot encroachment on the common grass is technically a debris violation, end quote. Mr. Miller looked like he was about to collapse, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. But it was Dale, the Vietnam vet from number 12, who stepped forward first, his arms folded over his chest, and a look in his eye that suggested he was back in '68. Then Linda joined him, then Raj, then Sasha with her phone out, recording every icy, bureaucratic word falling from Karen's lips. She sensed the tension, sure, but she stood firm in her delusion of power, confident that her brother, Councilman Donaldson, would pull the strings like he always did to keep her untouchable. She was wrong, because by noon, 5 of us were huddled in Raj's garage, staring at a whiteboard covered in timelines, fire codes, and HOA financial reports that Raj had, end quote, liberated, end quote, from the board's password-protected server overnight, end quote. She thinks she's the one who enforces the rules, end quote, Raj said, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses as he clicked through a series of suspicious invoices, end quote. But she's about to find out what happens when the rules start looking for her, end quote. We found it then, a $5,000 allocation for, end quote, water features, end quote, that had been funneled straight into a koi pond in Karen's backyard, disguised as community harmony consulting fees. The war for Maplewood Lane had officially begun, and while Karen was busy drafting 23 new violations for everything from, end quote, whimsical mailboxes, end quote, to, end quote, excessive festivity, end quote, we were building a digital and legal dossier that was going to do more than just get her fired. It was going to turn her own perfect, manicured world into an inflatable, neon pink nightmare that she couldn't indopos. T cut her way out of. We weren't indopos. T just angry. We were inspired. And as the sun set over the ruins of the Miller home, casting long, dark shadows across Karen's pristine lawn, a new kind of fire was ignited in the heart of our community. One that didn't indopos, T burn with heat, but with a cold, calculated, and hilariously petty kind of justice. If you've ever wondered how much damage a group of fed-up suburbanites can do with a high-speed internet connection and a shared sense of righteous indignation, Maplewood Lane was about to become your masterclass. We didn't start with lawsuits or shouting matches. No, we started with the, end quote, pink flamingo protocol, end quote. It began at 3 a.m. on a Friday when a single, neon pink plastic flamingo appeared in the center of Karen's meticulously laser-leveled front lawn, standing there like a neon middle finger to her aesthetic standards. By Saturday morning, there were 12, arranged in a perfect, mocking semicircle around her $5,000 koi pond. And let me tell you, watching Karen storm onto her lawn at dawn in a silk robe, yanking those birds out of the dirt with a face full of pure, unadulterated venom, was better than anything on cable TV. But the flamingos were just the appetizer, the real meat of, end quote, Operation Karma, end quote, was happening in Raj's garage, where the air was thick with the scent of dark roast coffee and the hum of 3 different laptops running at peak capacity. Raj had cracked the HOA's, end quote, Donaldson Eco Aesthetics, end quote, shell company wide open, revealing a paper trail that linked every single emergency landscaping feat to Karen's own personal backyard upgrades. The heated rocks for her koi, the miniature marble statues, the custom waterfall that hummed with the sound of stolen community dues. She's not just a control freak, Sasha noted, leaning over a spreadsheet while she edited a video of Karen's flamingo tantrum for her 4 million followers. She's a common thief with a savior complex and a very expensive taste in ornamental shrubs. The pranks escalated from satirical to legendary as Benny, using his old connections at the Regional Fire Academy, managed to borrow a decommissioned, bright red fire hydrant. We placed it directly on the edge of Karen's property line with a brass plaque that read, "In loving memory of common sense." Sasha organized a flash mob of local theater students who performed a synchronized dance routine in front of Karen's driveway to the tune of Disco Inferno, using empty garden hoses as props. Karen lost what was left of her mind, retreating into her fortress, and emerged only to paper the entire neighborhood in a blizzard of new citations. Dale got fined for aggressive lawn gnome placement, Linda for excessive cinnamon scent from her baking, and Raj for unauthorized Wi-Fi interference, It was a paper war, a sad, desperate attempt to reassert a dominance that was slipping through her fingers like dry sand. The tension reached a boiling point at the monthly HOA meeting, usually a somber affair attended by 3 retirees and a tray of stale oatmeal cookies, but this time, it was standing room only in the community hall. Karen sat at the front like a disgraced queen, her clipboard clutched so tight her knuckles were white, trying to open the meeting with a lecture on preserving community harmony after the unfortunate incident at the Miller house. But before she could even hit the gavel, Raj took the floor, his projector hummed to life, and a giant image of the Donaldson Eco-Aesthetics invoice for her koi pond hit the screen. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave of cold air. Karen, Raj said, his voice calm, echoing in the hushed room. Can you explain why the community and Oppos, Emergency Flora Fund and Oppos, paid for a heated filtration system at your house number 12? Karen's face turned a shade of crimson. I didn't and Oppos. Think was biologically possible, her voice cracking as she shrieked about slander and orchestrated attacks, But the board members, the people who had been her silent accomplices for years, were already looking at the floor, realizing the ship was sinking and the lifeboats were full. A motion for a vote of no confidence was introduced, the air in the room so thick with static it felt like a storm was about to break. And although she survived by a single, solitary vote, her own, the victory was a hollow, echoing thing. She walked out of that hall with her chin up, but everyone in that room knew she was a dead woman walking. That's when the grill sergeant took over. That weekend, Dale hosted a block party that made Karen's head practically spin on her shoulders. He fired up 3 massive smokers, the scent of hickory and scorched ribs of retribution wafting over Karen's fence while Sasha live-streamed the whole thing with a Karen tracker in the corner of the screen. Karen called the police 4 times in 3 hours, but when the officers arrived, they took one look at the permits we'd meticulously filed, grabbed a couple of Dale's famous hot dogs, and posed for selfies with the kids. Karen was losing the cops, she was losing the board, and as Benny unveiled a 12-foot inflatable fire truck right in the middle of the party, complete with a working slide and a speaker system playing "The Heat is On" her scream could probably be heard 3 counties over. She tried to fight back with the big gun her brother, Councilman Douglas Donaldson, who arrived on Maplewood Lane with a waxy smile and a team of damage control specialists to give a press conference about unity and respect It was a classic political move, a desperate attempt to bury the hose hacker narrative under a pile of bureaucratic fluff, but Raj was 3 steps ahead. He hacked the councilman's old campaign speeches, spliced them together into a viral remix where Douglas appeared to admit to covering up a few hose incidents, and uploaded it under the title, Burn Baby Burn, the Donaldson Remix. It hit 1 million views before the councilman even made it back to his office, and by the next morning, his black Suburban was gone, leaving Karen truly, utterly alone in her colonial-style bunker. Her final card was a massive, multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against every household on the street. She claimed the flamingos, the memes, the cupcakes shaped like fire extinguishers, and the hostile inflatable environment, were part of a coordinated conspiracy to destroy her reputation. But the legal notice never even made it past the city attorney's inbox. It was dismissed as, frivolous and retaliatory, faster than she could sharpen her garden shears. In fact, the city began an official investigation into the Donaldson Eco-Aesthetics fraud, and a fire inspection notice appeared on Karen's front door citing her koi pond's wiring as a, level 1 electrical fire risk, The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. But we weren't in Apos. Done. The Miller family was still living in a hotel, their son was still missing his trophies, and Karen was still sitting in her house, nursing her tea and her resentment, thinking the storm had passed. We didn't end Apos. Want just an apology. We wanted a transformation. Sasha launched a, Maplewood First Responders Fund, and in less than 72 hours, people from all over the world, moved by the footage of the fire and the sheer audacity of the hose cutting, had donated over $200,000. We weren't in Apos. Just going to rebuild the Miller house. We were going to prepare a, gift, for Karen that she would never, ever be able to return. A sunny Saturday morning arrived, the kind of day that looks perfect in a real estate brochure. And that's when the flatbed truck rolled into Maplewood Lane, hazard lights flashing and a small police escort leading the way just in case someone tried to interfere with the delivery. Neighbors poured out of their houses, coffee mugs in hand, as a massive crane began hoisting a tarp-covered structure into the air. Karen bolted from her front door in her signature beige tracksuit, clipboard shaking in her hand like a nervous squirrel, screaming about, unauthorized industrial vehicles, ordinance violations, But Dale just stepped in her path with a casual shrug and a firm, back off, General Mayhem. This is a Parks and Rec-approved installation, When the tarp was pulled back, the neighborhood gasped, then cheered, then erupted into a roar of laughter that echoed off the scorched remains of House 17. Sitting gloriously atop the truck, destined for the common ground directly in front of Karen's house, was a 30-foot-tall inflatable fire truck, glowing with solar-powered siren lights, and featuring a sound system that played a cheerful, obnoxious, fire truck funk, every hour on the hour. It was massive, it was magnificent, and printed in bold red letters across the side was the phrase, Maplewood Lane remembers. Karen's jaw dropped open like a rusty hinge, her clipboard finally slipping from her hand and clattering onto the tiles she had, saved, at the cost of a family's home. The sight of that 30-foot inflatable behemoth standing guard over the cul-de-sac was the final, neon-bright nail in the coffin of Karen Donaldson's reign. It wasn't Apos. Just a toy. It was a monument to her failure, a giant, smiling reminder that you can cut a hose, but you can't sever the spirit of a neighborhood that's found its backbone. Karen spent that entire Saturday afternoon pacing her porch like a caged leopard, her phone glued to her ear as she shrieked at the police, the zoning board, and probably the governor for all we knew, but the answer was always the same, It's a legal, temporary recreational installation, ma and Apos. Maybe you should try the slide. It might help you relax, By evening, under the glow of solar-powered floodlights, the inflatable truck looked like a beacon of justice, and the only sound you could hear on Maplewood Lane was the occasional, rhythmic hiss of the air pump, a sound that, to Karen, must have felt like a slow leak in her soul. But the real magic happened 3 weeks later, the day the Miller family finally returned to their rebuilt home. It wasn't Apos. Just a house anymore. It was a statement. Raj had coordinated the furniture deliveries. Sasha's followers had donated enough to cover their groceries for a year, and Dale and Benny had spent their weekends building a custom, fireproof shed in the backyard that looked like a miniature fortress. As the Millers pulled into their driveway, the whole street was lined with neighbors, not with clipboards, but with balloons and casseroles and a sense of peace that had been missing for a decade. Linda had filled their new kitchen with enough baked goods to feed a small army, along with a note that simply said, and quote, "Home is the people, not the drywall," end quote. Toward the end of the end quote, "Welcome home," end quote, party, Sasha took the microphone and led everyone down to the small park at the end of the lane, where a new structure sat draped in a heavy red cloth. End quote. Karen ruled by fear and citation, end quote, Sasha said, her voice echoing through the quiet evening air, end quote. But we chose humor and fireproof friendship, end quote. When the cloth was pulled back, there was a collective gasp. It was a life-sized bronze statue of a firefighter, one hand gripping a hose and the other cradling a cat, with a plaque beneath that read, "In honor of those who protect, serve, and never let a pair of garden shears get in their way." The kids immediately dubbed him, end quote, "Sir Hoses a lot," end quote, and he became the unofficial guardian of the street, a permanent reminder that Maplewood Lane was under new management. Karen didn't and Oppos. T stayed to see the statue's first anniversary. For a week after the festival, she stayed inside with her blinds drawn tight, occasionally peeking out like a raccoon caught in the headlights. The end quote, "For sale," end quote, sign appeared on her lawn on a Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no plot for a comeback, just a quiet, humiliating retreat. She packed her koi into plastic tubs, loaded her pearl-white Lexus, and drove away without a single word to the people she'd spent 10 years trying to crush. Her departure wasn't Oppos. T met with cheers, but with a deep, collective sigh of relief. It was like the air in the cul-de-sac had finally been scrubbed of a toxic fog. But karma, as they say, has a very long memory and a wicked sense of humor. 3 months later, Sasha received a blurry video from a friend who lived across town in a different HOA-controlled community. Karen had moved in, and by the second week, she was already back to her old tricks, leaving passive-aggressive notes on trash bins and threatening to, end quote, "revamp community standards," end quote. But the camera panned to show the house she had moved into. It was directly next door to a retired fire chief and across the street from a group home for off-duty paramedics. Within 48 hours of her first complaint, a bright red lawn chair had appeared on her neighbor and Oppos' driveway labeled, end quote, "Firewatch Post," end quote, and a garden flag featured a cartoon fire truck with the phrase, end quote, "We and Oppos, always on call," end quote. The neighborhood had been warned, and Karen was once again a small, angry fish in a very, very big pond. Back on Maplewood Lane, the silence isn't and Oppos heavy anymore. It's the kind of silence you can actually breathe in. The HOA was reorganized with a new policy that forbids electing anyone with a personal brand of vengeance, and Raj's AI system now tracks the budget with a level of transparency that would make a saint blush. Every morning, kids high-five, end quote, "Sir Hoses a lot," end quote, on their way to school, and every Saturday, someone leaves a small bunch of begonias at the base of the statue, a little wink to the past that we survived. The final delivery arrived on a crisp autumn morning, a small, unmarked box left at the base of the statue. Inside, wrapped in red tissue paper, was a tiny, gold-plated hose nozzle with a note written in perfect cursive, end quote, "For the ones who kept the fire going, just not the one in the house," end quote. No signature, no return address, just closure. We placed it in a glass display case in the community hall, right next to a photo collage of the inflatable truck and the, end quote, hose hacker, end quote, herself. It stands as a symbol of what happens when a community decides to be more than just a collection of property values. It becomes a family. Karen ruled by citation, but we chose cupcakes and flamingos and inflatable engines of justice. And in the end, we got exactly the neighborhood we deserved. So what do you think? Did Karen get off too easy with just a move and a few fines? Or was the, end quote, inflatable fire truck, end quote, the ultimate suburban punishment? I've seen some petty HOA power trips in my time, but cutting a pressurized fire hose mid-emergency is a level of, end quote, Karen, end quote, that honestly should have its own category in the penal code. Do you think the neighborhood and Oppos' response was the right way to handle it? Or should they have gone straight for a criminal trial? Have you ever had a neighbor so obsessed with, end quote, rules, end quote,
That they forgot about common humanity? Drop your wildest HOA horror stories in the comments below. I want to hear about the hose hackers in your neck of the woods. Don and Oppos. Forget to hit that like button if you think Sir Hoses a Lot is a legend. And subscribe for more stories of suburban karma served with a side of ribs.